The one who hurt you is not hiding from you. That is the illusion. What is truly happening is far more disturbing and far more revealing of the human mind than anything you have been told. Everyone around you says the avoidant person left because they were scared. Everyone says they will come back when they are ready. Both of these ideas are incomplete, and incomplete truths are more dangerous than lies, because they keep you waiting for a resolution that was never built to arrive the way you imagine it. There is a mechanism operating underneath this entire situation, a mechanism most people never see because it does not live in behavior. It lives in identity. It lives in the private war a person fights against becoming someone they do not recognize. Before this ends, you will understand why distance was never really about you, why silence was never really punishment, and why the truth behind their absence forces a confrontation with something far more important than their return. It forces a confrontation with who you become while you wait. Human beings do not actually fear distance the way psychology books describe it. What they fear is exposure. An avoidant person does not run from closeness because closeness feels bad. They run from closeness because closeness reveals a version of themselves they have spent years trying to bury. Somewhere early in their development, often before language could even capture the moment, they learned that need was dangerous, not painful, dangerous. A child who reaches for comfort and receives inconsistency does not conclude that people are unreliable. That child concludes something far more devastating. That child concludes that wanting is the problem. This single belief, formed in silence, becomes the architecture of an entire adult personality. Consider the strange fact that avoidant people often choose partners who are more emotionally expressive than themselves. This is rarely random. Psychologists who study attachment often miss the deeper function of this pattern. The avoidant person is not attracted to emotional expression by accident. They are drawn to it because it represents the very capacity they lost access to long ago. When they watch someone else feel deeply, safely, without shame, something inside them stirs. It is not romantic longing alone. It is grief. It is the ghost of a childhood self who was never permitted to feel that freely. And grief, when a person cannot name it, often disguises itself as discomfort, irritation, or the sudden need to retreat. This is the first hidden truth almost nobody discusses. The avoidant person is not withdrawing from you. They are withdrawing from the parts of themselves that you accidentally activated. You did not do anything wrong by being warm, open, or emotionally present. You simply became a mirror. And mirrors are unbearable to people who have spent a lifetime avoiding their own reflection. This does not excuse cruelty, dishonesty, or emotional negligence. It does explain why their absence often intensifies the moment intimacy deepens rather than the moment conflict arises. The nervous system does not read closeness as comfort. It reads closeness as risk. Now consider the second hidden truth, one that will feel uncomfortable at first, but which carries enormous liberation once understood. The person you are grieving was never fully real. Not because they lied to you, though sometimes they did. Not because they manipulated you, though sometimes that happened as well. They were never fully real because you were interacting with a version of them curated by fear. A person operating from unresolved trauma cannot offer you their full self because they do not have access to their full self. You were not rejected by a whole human being. You were rejected by a fragment trained since childhood to protect itself at the cost of connection. This does not mean you were unworthy. It means you were reaching for someone who could not yet reach back. There is a paradox hiding inside avoidant behavior that most people never notice because pain tends to blind us to complexity. The avoidant individual often experiences longing that is equal to or greater than the longing felt by the person they left. The difference is that their nervous system interprets longing as threat rather than desire. Imagine standing at the edge of a cliff, feeling an overwhelming urge to jump, not because you want to die, but because some primal part of your brain fears the fall so intensely that it creates the illusion of pull. This is closer to what avoidant longing feels like internally. They do not run because they feel nothing. They run because they feel too much, and their body has never learned how to survive feeling that much without collapsing. This is where most relationship content fails people. It tells the hurt person that the avoidant did not care, or that they were simply too damaged to love properly. Both explanations are too simple, and simplicity here becomes a trap, because it prevents real healing. Real healing requires nuance. The avoidant person may have cared deeply while still being incapable of demonstrating that care in a way that felt safe or satisfying to you. Two truths can exist simultaneously. They can care and still cause harm. They can love and still abandon. Human beings are not required to be consistent to be real. Contradiction is not evidence of deception. Contradiction is evidence of internal conflict. And internal conflict is the natural condition of anyone who has not yet integrated their wounds. Empathic individuals, the ones typically hurt in these dynamics, carry their own unseen contradictions as well. Society often paints them as innocent, loving, and simply unlucky in choosing emotionally unavailable partners. This narrative, while comforting, is incomplete and occasionally dishonest. Empaths are frequently drawn to avoidance not purely out of compassion, but because inconsistency creates a chemical intensity that steady love cannot replicate. The nervous system of a person raised in unpredictable emotional environments often mistakes anxiety for chemistry. Calm love can feel boring to a person whose baseline was shaped by uncertainty. This is not a flaw of character. It is a conditioned response, deeply embedded, often invisible until examined with brutal honesty. Here lies the third hidden truth, the one capable of transforming your entire perspective on heartbreak. You may not be grieving the avoidant person as much as you are grieving the reactivation of an old emotional wound they happen to touch. Their departure did not create your pain from nothing. It exposed pain that already existed, pain formed long before this relationship began. This explains why the suffering often feels disproportionate to the length of the relationship. A connection that lasted months can create devastation that feels like it should belong to a decade. This happens because unresolved emotional history amplifies present loss. You are not overreacting. You are encountering layered grief, grief stacked upon grief, much of it unrelated to the person currently occupying your thoughts. Philosophers have long understood something that modern relationship culture conveniently forgets. Suffering, when examined honestly, often reveals more about the sufferer than about the source of suffering. This is not a statement designed to minimize your pain. It is an invitation to study it. Pain that lingers long after someone leaves is rarely pure heartbreak. It is often identity disruption. When someone withdraws, they take with them a version of yourself that existed only in relation to them. The person who laughed a certain way, who felt desired a certain way, who believed in a future a certain way. That version of you did not disappear because they were real. It disappeared because it was dependent on their presence to exist. This is the quiet devastation nobody prepares you for. You are not only mourning them, you are mourning yourself. Notice how rarely anyone asks the avoidant person what they are protecting themselves from, because society has already decided their silence is selfishness rather than self-preservation. This assumption, though understandable, blocks a deeper understanding of what actually happens inside their mind during distance. When an avoidant person disappears, they are not sitting somewhere feeling triumphant. Many of them are locked in a private courtroom, prosecuting themselves for a crime they cannot fully articulate. They replay conversations. They question their own capacity to love. They wonder if they are broken beyond repair. This internal trial rarely produces resolution because shame does not create clarity. Shame creates avoidance of the very reflection required to heal. So they stay away, not because the verdict favors freedom, but because they cannot bear to face the judge living inside their own mind. A strange and rarely discussed phenomenon occurs in the nervous system of someone who avoids intimacy. Distance does not bring them peace the way outsiders assume. It brings a different kind of noise, quieter but corrosive over time. Silence becomes a room filled with unanswered questions about their own worth. Many avoidants describe a peculiar emptiness during periods of separation, an emptiness they cannot explain to friends who assume solitude equals relief. This emptiness exists because the avoidant person has spent their life training themselves to survive without connection, not because connection stopped mattering, but because needing it once felt unsafe. Surviving without something is not the same as no longer wanting it. A person can master detachment and still ache in places language cannot reach. Consider a truth that dismantles a common myth people repeat to comfort themselves after heartbreak. The idea that an avoidant person will eventually change for the right person is often false, not because change is impossible, but because change cannot be outsourced to another human being. Growth requires confrontation with the self, not confrontation with love. A person can be surrounded by patience, warmth, and unconditional support and still fail to transform, because transformation is an internal decision, not an external reward. This is not meant to extinguish hope, it is meant to redirect it. Hoping someone changes because they finally found the right person places your healing in someone else's hands. Hoping someone changes because they finally decided to face themselves places responsibility where it has always belonged. There is a philosophical concept worth introducing here, one rarely applied to modern heartbreak, yet deeply relevant. Existential thinkers often describe human suffering as arising not from circumstance itself, but from the meaning assigned to circumstance. The absence of an avoidant partner is a fact. The story built around that absence determines whether it becomes destruction or education. If the story becomes "I was not enough," suffering compounds indefinitely. If the story becomes "I encountered someone unable to meet me," and that experience revealed patterns I must now understand within myself, suffering transforms into insight. The event does not change, the meaning does. And meaning is something you construct, not something imposed upon you by another person's inability to stay. A darker truth deserves attention here, one many self-help creators avoid because it disrupts the comforting narrative of pure victimhood. Sometimes the connection ends not because the avoidant person failed to see your worth, but because both individuals were unconsciously seeking validation rather than partnership. Empathic individuals often overextend themselves in relationships, believing that enough love, patience, or understanding will eventually earn safety and permanence. This overextension, while appearing selfless, frequently masks an unspoken need to be indispensable. Being needed can feel like being loved, even when the two are not the same. If your worth felt tied to how much you could fix, soothe, or stabilize another person, the relationship was never purely about them. It was also an unconscious attempt to prove your own value through usefulness. Human beings often mistake intensity for depth, a confusion that fuels countless heartbreaks disguised as soulmate connections. Intensity can emerge from unpredictability, unresolved trauma, or unstable communication patterns, none of which indicate compatibility or genuine emotional safety. Depth, by contrast, is built slowly, through consistency, honesty, and mutual regulation of each other's nervous systems. Many people mourn the loss of intensity and call it the loss of love. This is not always accurate. Sometimes what ends is chaos disguised as chemistry, and the grief that follows is not grief for a healthy bond, but grief for the adrenaline that chaos provided. Recognizing this distinction does not eliminate pain, but it prevents you from romanticizing dysfunction simply because it felt powerful. An unsettling question deserves asking directly. What if the avoidant person staying away is not a tragedy, but an unintentional act of protection? Protection you did not ask for and may not want, yet protection nonetheless. Relationships built on one person's chronic emotional unavailability often force the other person into a permanent state of self-abandonment, where their needs shrink to accommodate someone else's fear. If the avoidant person had stayed while remaining unhealed, the relationship may have continued eroding your self-respect slowly, disguised as patience and unconditional love. Sometimes distance, though painful, interrupts a pattern that would have caused deeper long-term damage than the heartbreak currently being felt. Self-respect is rarely discussed in the context of heartbreak, yet it is the single most important psychological asset determining how quickly a person heals. Self-respect is not about pretending you do not care. It is about refusing to distort reality in order to keep hope alive. Many people remain trapped in cycles of longing because they secretly believe that waiting proves loyalty, and loyalty proves love. This belief system is not rooted in truth. It is rooted in fear. The fear that letting go means the connection meant nothing. Letting go does not erase meaning. It honors meaning by refusing to let it decay into obsession. A person with self-respect does not need someone to return in order to validate that the relationship mattered. There exists a psychological concept known as identity foreclosure, typically discussed in developmental psychology, yet rarely applied to heartbreak. Identity foreclosure occurs when a person commits to an identity prematurely without fully exploring who they are outside of that commitment. Many individuals unconsciously experience a version of this after a painful relationship ends, clinging to the identity of the hurt one, the abandoned one, the person who loved too much. While this identity may feel true in the immediate aftermath, prolonged attachment to it prevents psychological growth. Pain can inform your story without becoming your entire identity. The moment you allow suffering to define you permanently, you unknowingly gift your identity to the very person who left. Something curious happens inside the mind of a person waiting for an avoidant to return, something rarely named because it feels too uncomfortable to admit. Waiting itself becomes a form of control, not control over the other person, but control over uncertainty. As long as you are waiting, you do not have to face the harder question of who you become without them. Waiting feels like action, though it is often paralysis dressed in patience. The mind prefers the ache of longing to the void of the unknown, because longing at least gives suffering a direction. This is why so many people stay fixated on someone who has already left in every way except memory. The fixation is not really about them. It is about avoiding the terrifying blank page that begins the moment you stop waiting. Grief scholars have long observed a distinction between grieving a death and grieving an absence with no closure, and heartbreak involving an avoidant person often resembles the second far more than the first. Death, however devastating, offers a fixed boundary. Ambiguous loss offers none. The mind, unable to locate an ending, keeps searching for one, replaying scenarios, imagining reunions, constructing alternate outcomes where different words might have changed everything. This search is not weakness. It is the brain attempting to create the closure that circumstance refused to provide. Understanding this mechanism does not stop the search immediately, but it explains why moving on from an avoidant often feels harder than moving on from someone who simply died to the relationship through clear, final rejection. A confronting truth now deserves attention, one capable of reframing the entire situation. The avoidant person staying away may have very little to do with you as an individual, and almost everything to do with a war being fought inside them long before you arrived. This is difficult to accept, because human beings crave significance, especially in pain. It feels more bearable to believe you failed at something specific than to accept you encountered a pattern already in motion, a pattern shaped by people who existed in their life before you were ever born. Your presence did not create their wound. Your presence exposed it. There is a profound difference between causing damage and revealing damage that already existed, and mistaking one for the other keeps countless people trapped in unnecessary self-blame. Consider the unsettling possibility that some avoidant individuals unconsciously choose partners capable of deep love, specifically because deep love feels unbearable to receive without eventually sabotaging it. This is not calculated cruelty. It is a tragic loop, often invisible even to the person living inside it. A part of them seeks connection because human beings are wired for bonding. Another part sabotages that same connection because closeness threatens the survival strategy built in childhood. Two opposing forces occupy the same mind, and when opposing forces are strong enough, the result is not compromise. The result is retreat. Understanding this does not obligate you to keep loving someone trapped in that loop. It simply removes the illusion that their retreat was a measured judgment against your worth. Philosophy offers another lens rarely applied here, one concerning the difference between suffering that destroys and suffering that initiates transformation. The same event, heartbreak involving an avoidant partner, can either fracture a person permanently or become the exact catalyst that forces long overdue self-examination. What determines the outcome is rarely the severity of the pain itself. It is the willingness to interrogate the pain rather than simply endure it. Many people experience heartbreak and emerge unchanged, having merely survived it. Fewer people experience heartbreak and emerge transformed, having extracted meaning from it. The difference between these two outcomes is not luck. It is the decision to turn suffering into a mirror instead of a wound that is only ever bandaged, never examined. There is a hidden emotional contradiction inside empathic individuals that deserves direct confrontation, uncomfortable as it may be. Many empaths pride themselves on their capacity to understand others deeply, yet remain strangers to their own internal world. They can predict the emotional needs of an avoidant partner with startling accuracy while remaining unaware of their own unmet needs, buried beneath years of prioritizing everyone else's comfort. This imbalance is not virtuous. It is a survival strategy learned early, often in households where a person's own needs were treated as inconvenient or excessive. Loving an avoidant person can become an unconscious replication of that early dynamic, chasing emotional availability from someone unlikely to provide it, mistaking the chase itself for proof of your own capacity to love unconditionally. A rarely discussed truth now emerges regarding what actually heals a person after this kind of heartbreak, and it is not time, contrary to popular belief. Time alone does not heal anything. Time merely creates distance from the event, allowing the illusion of healing to form on the surface while the underlying wound remains untouched beneath layers of distraction. Genuine healing requires confrontation, not avoidance disguised as moving forward. This means examining why the absence hurt as deeply as it did, what unmet childhood needed activated, and what belief about your own worth became attached to their departure. Skipping this process does not eliminate the wound. It simply delays its resurfacing in a future relationship, often with someone entirely different, yet strangely familiar in the pain they eventually cause. Responsibility in this context does not mean blaming yourself for someone else's inability to love you fully. Responsibility means recognizing that your healing cannot depend on their transformation, their apology, or their eventual return. This distinction matters immensely because many people confuse healing with vindication. They believe closure arrives when the other person finally admits their mistake, finally understands what they lost, finally suffers in proportion to the suffering they caused. This belief keeps your healing hostage to someone else's timeline, someone who may never reach the self-awareness required to offer the closure you are waiting for. Real freedom begins the moment you stop requiring their understanding as a prerequisite for your own peace. There is a final layer beneath all of this, quieter than the rest, yet perhaps the most important. The relationship you are grieving was never truly about them staying or leaving. It was a mirror reflecting exactly how much of yourself you were willing to abandon in exchange for the possibility of being chosen. This is not a comfortable realization, but comfort was never the purpose of this examination. The moment you see this mirror clearly, the absence of the avoidant person stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like information. Information about where your boundaries dissolved, where your identity blurred into someone else's inconsistency, and where your own healing work has been quietly waiting for your attention long before this person ever entered your life. The truth was never about whether the avoidant returns. The truth is about who you become while they stay away. Their silence is not a verdict on your worth. It is a mirror showing you exactly where you stopped honoring yourself long before they ever left. Stop waiting for someone else's healing to grant you permission to live fully again. Today, take one honest action. Sit down and write the belief their absence activated in you, the oldest one, the one that existed before this relationship began. Face it directly. Do not soften it. That belief, not their return, is the real obstacle standing between you and freedom. A person who requires another human being to complete their sense of worth will always be waiting for someone. A person who does the internal work required to feel whole on their own will never wait for anyone again. The absence you fear is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of the only relationship that was ever truly required, the one with yourself.